Welcome, everyone. I hope this will be a thoughtful subject that I'm going to cover. It's one that I wrote about some years ago and have delivered this lecture in the classroom, and it generated a fair amount of discussion and interest. So hopefully you'll find it entertaining and a bit thoughtful, and maybe it'll raise some questions you have, or you want to challenge my thinking on the subject. So we'll find out as we go through this. But it's mostly going to be a lot of images that you're going to see on the screen accompanying my text. So yeah, the subject that I've chosen is the different meanings of natural law and the difference this makes. And we live in a time when our understanding of the natural forces at work in the universe is rapidly expanding. That said, physicists and astronomers do not yet have a provable theory of the origins of the universe. And for the most part, they're reluctant to publicly challenge the widespread belief in a conscious creator. And yet, there are some, myself included, who have rejected this possibility on the basis of the evidence, and what we suggest is common sense. And I know that is a controversial statement. The historical record convinces us that life on this planet has evolved without conscious direction or guidance, subject only to the limitations imposed and potentials offered by the natural forces at play. And that's what this involved schematic here is designed to show. Well, scientific evidence tells us that our species was not a certain outcome of evolutionary processes, and that those processes continue as part of the natural laws governing the physical universe. Foolishly, our own actions may precipitate the extinction of our species as we destroy the life-supporting capacity of this planet. So, think about that in terms of what forces are at work with regard to human behavior. Our most important evolutionary distinction from other animals, I would suggest, is our emergence from a purely instinctive stage of existence into a stage during which our ancestors acquired the capacity to contemplate and react to their environment. For hundreds of successive generations of early humans, the world they experienced was inexplicable. Threats to their survival were constant and everywhere. Weather changed from sweltering heat to freezing cold, from drenching rains to prolonged periods of drought. The ground periodically shook and swallowed everything. The tops of mountains sometimes breathed toxic smoke and fire. There were frozen balls of ice that fell to the ground during storms. And then bolts of lightning brought down trees and ignited great fires. More than that, even powerful storms raged along the coasts, washed away entire portions of the land. Swirling funnels of air stormed across the plains, destroying everything in their path. You're getting the sense that nature was unpredictable and not really understandable to our ancient ancestors. And then mysteriously, the sun disappeared with regularity over the horizon, only to reappear just as regularly. The sky darkened. It revealed an enormous white object and countless other glowing and even moving objects. What to make of all these mysterious and terrifying events? That was what occupied the thinking person of our ancestry. So gradually, over a long period of time, one person here and there began to recognize patterns in what most others saw as random events. They became, in their groups, the knowledge bearers, and they passed on their skills to younger proteges. And as their knowledge of the environment increased and improved, the survival chances of the group, well, their status rose. And so we have individuals who have this unique knowledge not shared by others. The knowledge bearers then developed their own rituals to further distinguish themselves from others in the group and to generate deeper insight into the unexplainable, into what would be thought of as the supernatural. In nearly every human society, their role eventually evolved into that of a priestcraft. Humankind had therefore created the gods, and the priestcraft capitalized on human fears of the unknown to become the channel by which the gods communicated their directives. Over thousands of years, the rituals and superstitious responses of people became increasingly formalized. The result was the establishment of the institution of religion. As oral tradition was supplemented by written language among the ancients, the power of the priestcraft over human affairs actually intensified. The gods, all powerful, were accepted as the unquestioned organizers of the natural world and rulers over human behavior. And as generations of philosophers gave thought to the role of the gods in directing our actions, they offered a theological basis for moral judgments. Historians generally point to the Stoics of the Hellenistic period as the first school of philosophers to connect the moral concept of justice with that of natural law. Aristotle and later Roman writers asserted that the laws of any society must be based on natural, that is, the equivalent of moral law, in order to be just. And yet Aristotle accepted the idea of moral relativism, that natural law could be different for different societies and at different times. When the writings of these ancients were rediscovered and examined, Christian theologians sought to define natural law as the law dictated by the God embraced by Christianity. In this sense, moral relativism was resurrected and institutionalized. The natural law of Christianity was given concrete form in the writings of Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas declared that our free will demanded we make use of our, quote, God-given reasoning powers to act justly in accord with natural law. By this means, skipped over one of my slides here. The philosopher Mortimer Adler stated the obvious when he wrote this. He says, "Man often violates the moral rules which constitute the law of his specifically human nature. By this he means, I surmise, that we do not consistently adhere to the objective rules of behavior required to secure our natural rights as members of society. A great risk of injustice occurs, I believe, when the specific elaboration of rules governing behavior is based on a claim of divinely inspired natural law and that demands unquestioning obedience. Arguably, the fundamental moral principles at the core of the world's most widely embraced religions have an essential commonality. One is hard-pressed, however, to find an unblemished connection between this commonality and the supposedly divinely inspired written preachings of individual prophets as interpreted by those self-selected to the priestcraft. What we know from history, what we observe in our everyday experience, is that human behavior most directly subject to natural law falls in the realm of behavior over which we have virtually no conscious control. Let me read that again. What we know from history, what we observe in our everyday experience, is that human behavior most directly subject to natural law falls in the realm of behavior over which we have virtually no conscious control. And keep that in mind as an extremely important point that I'm trying to make. Our biological nature dictates how our body functions without requiring us to think about what is occurring. A significant portion of our brain power is dedicated to the tasks of keeping the body alive and able to perform. Some portions of our brain function without conscious effort, that is, without contemplation, to perform necessary bodily functions. This, I argue, is the extent to which human activity is governed by natural law. When we explain these functions, we do so descriptively, with no reason to raise questions of moral law. We can say, therefore, that our species is subject to the same natural laws as other creatures and life forms, as well as all that makes up the material universe. The philosopher need not be concerned with these descriptive laws. Only in the realm of conscious human behavior are moral judgments required. And not only philosophers have an obligation to answer these ought questions. Well, as we are all subject to the positive law of society, of the nation state, the securing and protection of our moral rights is our individual and collective responsibility. For reasons of clarity, of thought, and of expression, then, I hold the position that we must limit the use of the term natural law to descriptive statements only and frame all prescriptive statements as elements of moral law. If then there is such a thing as objective moral law, independent of religious doctrine, from where does it arise? Have we acquired over the hundreds of thousands of years of human existence a hardwired, if imperfect, moral sense of right and wrong? The moral philosopher in me concludes that wrong is wrong, even if everyone is doing it, and right is right, even if I am the only one doing it. How do I know which is which? Thomas Jefferson, for one, credited, quote, "He who made us," with endowing us with our moral sense. And yet Jefferson also observed that our moral sense, quote, "may be strengthened by exercise." And of course, what he meant by that is by constant thought and by behavior and observing what our behavior, the outcomes of our various behavior. An intriguing question for scientists, then, is the extent to which the moral sense possessed by biological parents is passed on to offspring. Nature and nurture combine to reinforce either positively or negatively the moral sense with which we are born. Which is the more powerful influence we do not yet know with any certainty. From every generation since the days of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, at least a few thoughtful, inquiring members of our species have contributed to the potential refinement of our moral sense. They examined the norms and rules of behavior of their own societies against what reason convinced them was the ideal, that is, what is consistent with their construct of the moral law. The cumulative effect of their efforts has been to keep alive the dialogue on moral law and, equally important, the rights derived therefrom. That such rights exist as abstract values is a position held by those who trace our origins to an existence in the state of nature, out of which we come together to form societies. We in the English-speaking societies can trace the ideal basis for our socio-political arrangements and institutions to the writings of John Locke. In his second treatise of civil government, Locke described the state of nature as a pre-societal existence as, quote, a state of perfect freedom to order our actions and dispose of our possessions and persons as we think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. Philosopher Robert V. Andelson, in his 1971 book, Imputed Rights, reminded his readers of one of the most serious threats to such an existence. He said, in the state of nature, rights exist, but they are enforceable only in proportion to their claimant's power. Reason suggests, therefore, that the protection of our natural rights of the individual requires a collective commitment to do so. This Locke realized and offered the pragmatic solution. Locke tells us, men being, as has been said, by nature all free, equal, and independent, no one can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. The only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living one amongst another. And finally, in a secure enjoyment of their properties and a greater security against any that are not of it, this any number of men may do, because it injures not the freedom of the rest. They are left as they were in the liberty of the state of nature. Rational behavior brings us together voluntarily to form communities, expanding as societies to secure and protect our natural rights and to enhance our prospects for survival. At least that is how Locke explained the ideal. However, by this standard, are there any societies where positive law lives up to the ideal? With the exception of the few remaining communitarian tribal societies, hierarchy has been the consistent instrument of entrenched power grabbed and held by minority elites, more often than not in league with a state-mandated or state-supported religion. Such power always has been maintained by a shrewd combination of direct force, institutionalized ritual, and appeal to the darker influences on our behavior. In the process, moral relativism has displaced moral law as the basis for positive law in society after society. Locke observed that positive law too often permitted the exercise of license by some in violation of the liberty of others. The constant struggle to secure our natural rights is a struggle to prevent the exercise of license, another word for which is privilege. Thankfully, defenders of moral law have never been fully silenced, if not embraced by the people of their era. Thomas Paine comes to mind as one of the great stalwart defenders of moral law and the natural rights derived therefrom. In his writings, Paine called for an end to privilege as the only way to realize our potential as moral beings. And again, Mortimer Adler devoted his life to defining moral law in pursuit of an educated citizenry. And in his writings, he asks, what is a moral right as Contra distinguished from a legal right? He says that it is obvious at once that it must be a right that exists without being created by positive law or social custom. what is not the product of legal or social conventions must be a creation of nature, or to state the matter more precisely, it must have its being in the nature of men. Moral rights are natural rights, rights inherent in man's common or specific nature, just as his natural desires or needs are. Such rights, being antecedent to society and government, may be recognized and enforced by society, or they may be transgressed and violated. And he ends with this. But they are inalienable in the sense that, not being the gift of legal enactment, they cannot be taken away or annulled by acts of government. In summary, and we're getting very close to the end of my presentation here. In summary, if we are ever to lift the people of this world from the oppression that denies them what Adler called, quote, the goods of a decent human existence, we need to find our way to a universal understanding of what constitutes moral law. A necessary first step, I submit, is to consistently treat natural law as descriptive of what is, while treating moral law as prescriptive of what ought to be. And with that, I finished my argument, and I open it up to the opportunity for you to respond and react. Thanks a lot.
This is Dan Sullivan. We're gonna open it up. So if you want to be seen, put your camera on. Until you have a question, it's better to mute yourself, and then either hold the space bar down or click unmute when you want to ask a question. So let me figure out how to promote to panelist. Do you have to do this one at a time?
Yeah, one at a time. Why don't we take a question while you do that? I think we have a question up here.
Or comment.
Yeah, Scott Baker, you want to comment? You had a comment for us? He said that according to Locke, we have a long way to go.
Well, absolutely. We still have a long way to go. We're just the very beginning of this debate, and certainly contemporary events suggest that maybe we're not as far as they were when Locke was writing and Jefferson was debating this with others.
Okay. So yeah, Scott apologized. He has no audio option, just a comment. So appreciate it. Okay. We've got about 15 of us total. Let me see if I can get everybody.
Have I been so persuasive and clear that no one has any responses?
Turn off your screen, Ed.
Turn off my screen.
Yeah.
Your shared screen, I think that's what he's talking about.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. All right, now we should. All right. Nobody wants to be seen. Oh yeah, Brendan wants to be. What's up, Brendan? Okay. And
if anyone has anything substantive, it would be Brendan to add to this conversation.
okay. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Ed. I think you did a great job on the historical aspect of showing the development of natural law. I would like us Georges, Frank Peddle did an excellent essay on George's interpretation of natural law in the Two Views of Justice, about done out of Scranton. But the question I've got for you, Dan, is you talk about natural law, but Thomas Aquinas, he defined 4 types of law: eternal law, divine law, natural law, and human law. There's some confusion about what eternal and natural law is. But when you talk about natural law, what do you see as the main, because in economics, natural law is not talked about today. So how can you see that natural law can become more prominent in our present society? especially to do with economics?
Well,
Thanks.
one way to explain the fact that we do not behave consistently with moral law is because our behavior is consistent with our nature, and our nature is imperfect. And so we're striving to become more perfect in our behavior, to be consistent, not with natural law, but with moral law. Now, the debate, those of the people who have a strong belief in a conscious creator believe it's divinely inspired. And I'm simply raising the question as someone who's not motivated by a belief in a conscious creator, that I think we have a moral sense of right and wrong, and that moral sense may be passed on from generation to generation through biology, but which has to be constantly nurtured by the societal associations we have when we're born and raised. So it comes from our biological parents or our guardians, then it comes by our extended family, and then our larger group, and eventually by society as a whole. So that's basically what I think is driving us to have a quest to find what is a just society. It's this moral sense of right and wrong, and some of us are driven by that moral sense of right and wrong to constantly work to find the relationships that constitute a just society.
Dan Sullivan has a question, but you have two screens open, Ed.
I think one of them is Victor Madison, because he's a colleague of mine in Thomas Paine Friends, and I invited him to join us, and I forwarded him my invitation. So that's why.
That's why we have two Eds. Okay,
Yeah.
well then we'll rename that one. And thank you. All right, Dan.
Yeah, I just, Henry George talked about moral law being an objective law. And just like the laws of distribution, he took them to task that the laws of distribution are, I think it was John Stuart Mill said that they were, we could make them whatever we want. And his idea was that if you do that, your economy will crash. And so I've been thinking about that, and I compare it to aerodynamics. You can violate the laws of aerodynamics, but I don't want to ride in your airplane if you do. And so I make the connection between morality and morale. That a society that has bad morality, or even an individual who has bad morality, will end up with bad morale. The society will become narcissistic or otherwise dysfunctional. So in that sense, then morality could be objective. It's the the scriptural thing is, by their fruits you shall know them, and so you can assess whether a morality works by what happens to the society that indulges that morality.
Well, we can't underestimate the power of the priestcraft. Just listen to evangelical Christian preachers and what they're saying to their congregations and the influence that they have. And certainly this is true of every religion. And so I think we have to be aware and skeptical of those who claim their ability to communicate with the gods and then tell the rest of us what the gods are saying and how we should therefore live and behave.
Well, I didn't say anything about gods, so I'm not sure what you're.
Well, you talked about the difference between morality and morale, yeah. And so you have a whole group of people whose morale is very strong, but for the very wrong reasons. And that might not come from the priestcraft. It might come from a charismatic leader who doesn't have the morality of a Henry George, but has the ability to motivate people, as did, Mao Zedong or Adolf Hitler, or perhaps some leaders who are closer to home.
Yeah, I don't think their high morale lasted very long, though. So
No,
it's maybe not an instant test.
Scott Baker's next.
Yeah, so You know, I met a lot of people who say that there's basically no moral rights at all, no natural law, no right and wrong. It's just a matter of who's in power imposing their will upon others. I don't believe that, but I think we get into a very dangerous place when we say that there's some natural rights or natural law that leads to our moral judgment that's not based on something biologically identifiable.
Well, you said, it sounds like you're agreeing with me, Scott, or am I misinterpreting?
Yeah, I am, but it's just, I think that all of our rights, well, you said this too, it comes from a biological basis, but I think it can narrow it down a little bit more. Basically, if we all lived in a way where we all took whatever we want and you know, took whoever we wanted, let's say, there'd be no such thing as society, and that would be counterproductive to our species enduring and even surviving on an individual level, because we'd be killing each other off all the time. And we can actually look at some anarchy societies and maybe see where there's no government or where there's very weak government, that's kind of what happens. Warlords take over, then they get killed and displaced by other warlords. So I think the morality that we seek here, I think that comes from not wanting to have that kind of society, and that's a collective wisdom, or it's built in or something like that. And that's where our morality comes from. But beyond that, I don't know that there's much, as much we can say for certain, because every society seems to have a different moral code, and there's a mentality and a
I mean, history is filled with a constant attempt by thoughtful people, often referred to as philosophers, seeking universal principles of justice and best practices of social organization. So, you know, we're, as you say, we're totally dependent on community for our survival. You know, we do not survive without, you know, support from some extended community. We're born into this world helpless. I mean, there's no way for us to survive as infants and to eventually grow into adults, or in legal terms, you know, develop competency and then be treated as adults without the involvement of an extended community.
Oops. We have an overflow on someplace. Anybody else have any more questions or comments? Please raise your hand. Hearing somebody in the background. Not sure who it is.
Well,
wait.
whoever has their microphone on and has a radio on in the background.
Yes.
Yeah, Will Batter's got his microphone on.
Ah, okay. All right. Let me. Nope. There, he fixed himself. Okay, fine. Anybody else have more questions, comments?
I don't know. Either I've done a terrible job or a really great job.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, Dave's got his hand up. No, you're on mute. Unmute, please.
We were ready for land varying taxation, but this was something way out of where that I can even think of. That's why no questions. Aye.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, well, it's one of those issues that from the time I was a very young person troubled me, and particularly as I started to read Mortimer Adler. As I mentioned to Dan and Sue before we started this, Mortimer Adler has been in my life one of the most influential writers on my thinking. I mean, his 30-some books are all, you know, remarkably insightful, and I recommend them all to you. They really begin to trouble you to think deeply about how we're organized and our relationship with one another, and the system of government that we have, and whether we choose to have this government, and what constitutes justice. And Adler's specialty was interpreting Aristotle, and one of his books is really one that I would hope would become used as a required reading in every introductory course in philosophy, and it's titled The Common Sense of geez, now my now I'm having a senior moment. It'll come to me in a minute or two. But I have a lot of his writings on my School of Cooperative Individualism website. If you go into the authors section, and the title of the book that I'm thinking of is titled The Common Sense of Politics.
Okay.
Yeah, Scott Baker just kind of all in the choir here.
There's a book by Michigan governor called Common Sense Revolution. They talk similar to what you're saying.
Perhaps.
And I read a book, a friend of mine gave me a book called Mere Christianity, very small book. When I started because C.S. Lewis was an atheist, and his PhD thesis was his PhD thesis was how he became Christian, kind of thing. And this book is about that. Mere Christianity is about that. So it tells us how Bible converts into law, the practice of law. And the law today that we have is nothing but interpretation of the Bible. So what we have stretched the law to a point that in that Bible sense, you cannot lie. But nowadays, white lying is kind of okay. In some cases, to save somebody's life, saying lie is okay. So that book changed. Like I learned a lot from that book. But I'll read your book with what you're saying too. So
Okay. All right. Brendan has his hand up.
Yeah, Ed, have you ever read any of Christopher Dawson's, the British historian, from any of his books? Because he talks a lot about culture and religion. He was at Oxford Dawn, famous. He died in something like 1970. Christopher Dawson. I'll send you an email to some of his works. Yeah, because he addresses the issue that you brought up about the relationship of the priesthood to development of culture, etc. But the question I've got is, you mentioned that about biology, that we're born, and could you walk us through, if you say from a Christian background, you would say, well, I'm born, I have it's in my nature as a human being to have certain, I'm a rational human being. And if you're a Christian, you say, well, we're made in the image of God, and therefore we use that rationality for the common good. It's always aimed for the common good. But if you take that out of the equation on a more secular view, you talked about the biology. My question is, when you're born and you have this biology, how do you get the concept of natural rights if you don't have any concept of supreme intellect, creator, etc.? How is it passed on to you?
Well, again, I don't pretend to know the answer exactly, but you think of this way: if I'm born and my biological parents disappeared, and I was raised by wolves, I would lose that moral sense of right and wrong to a large degree, because there wouldn't be the nurturing that occurs from my human parents and from the family into which I'm born. So my thought is that over the many generations of human beings born, to some degree, this moral sense of right and wrong has become hardwired into our brain. So some level of moral sense of right and wrong is passed on to us when we're born from our biological parents, from their DNA. And how much of it is, I don't know, but it's clear if you look at the behavior of infants and young children that they do have a moral sense of right and wrong in their behavior, although it's not very well developed. And so parents have to help guide that by encouraging their behavior when it's positive and discouraging the behavior when it's negative. So, you know, when you were young, if you had a younger brother or sister and you started to beat on them for no good reason, your parents would prevent that from happening and make you understand that was the wrong thing to do. And if you were generous and helped your siblings and you shared your possessions with them and helped them when they needed it, you'd get a pat on the back and encouragement. And so that would further cement your moral sense that you're born with. It would make it more, personal to you because it would be strengthened by your nurturing.
But just one very quick, but you're talking more about society, gives the children, the family, then society, the larger unit. It is that gives us our moral sense.
Yes.
Societies can be, I think we're thinking from a very Western perspective, but societies.
I don't know of any group of humans that has much of a very different relationship with teaching the young. I mean, and of course, if you have a group that has accepted behavior based on moral relativism, and they have a very how do I say it? A very strange sense of what is right and wrong, then the children that were born into that society are going to be educated with a very strange sense of right and wrong. I give you an example that I've used in the classroom in talking about this subject. Let's say everyone in the room today constitutes all the members of our community. We have total control over our laws in our society. And we meet every so often and vote, and we discuss our problems, and we vote to adopt changes in law or new law. So we are in this giant community meeting, and one of the problems that comes up is everyone is concerned about double parking. And so we take a vote on what should we do about double parking, and someone, advances the motion that we should invoke the death penalty on people who are guilty of double parking. And we vote unanimously in favor of this penalty. Now, that's democracy at work. It's moral relativism, but anyone outside of that group who's not influenced by whatever the influence was to cause them to reach that decision is going to immediately recognize that it's unjust. And so we see that as we look around the world at different societies and the practices in different societies that are fully accepted by the majority of the people in those societies, in those groups. And yet we look at what is happening there from the standpoint of a universal perspective on what constitutes human rights and justice. And we reach the conclusion that despite the fact that it is almost universally accepted, it's wrong. And, and those people in that society may look at many things that we believe to be just, and we vote in accordance with our moral sense of right and wrong. And they would look at us and say, we're wrong. So what philosophers have tried to do throughout history is find the right answer to that question. What is right and what is wrong? And can it be universally applied to all societies, regardless of, the other differences in the people who constitute those societies.
Dan has a question.
Yeah, I'd like to draw on two things. One is two people. One is Brett Weinstein, who is an evolutionary biologist. And hang on a second. And he basically said that since all major cultures have religions, and these religions sprang up rather independently of each other, that the religions themselves must serve an evolutionary purpose. Otherwise, they would not be. Things survive because they are advantageous to the group that has them. So his thesis was that whether the religion is true or not, it serves an evolutionary purpose. And things like, you know, we tend to not ask ourselves questions that religion has answered in a non-scientific way. For example, his thing was like, okay, we have a very strong sex drive. Why do we have a very strong sex drive? Ed, you're muted. It was that we have a strong sex drive because you need to have a strong sex drive in order to be for a woman to be willing to get pregnant, for a man to be so emotionally involved.
Tom, you want to ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of comments. Again, great presentation, Ed. Thank you. I think, you know, to build on what Dan was saying about evolutionary, the question about and this is a field that's really grown by leaps and bounds in the last 50 years, but evolutionary psychology and evolutionary economics. It's part of, I don't know if anybody's heard of the Evo economics or new economics that's coming out of Oxford in England, and endorsed by about 5 or 6 Nobel laureates, including Stiglitz and Krugman and others. And really, it's not really a mystery why we have the qualities we have today, because the ancestors who had different qualities actually died off or were killed. And so the reality is that, you know, there's a big mistake that I forget the guy's name who wrote The Selfish Gene, but that's been completely disproven. In fact, Darwin never said, use the term survival of the fittest. That was a term that was coined by Herbert Spencer. And the reality of what Darwin wrote and today's advances in evolutionary biology show it's really survival of those who cooperate. And the people who were able to work together and form societies and be effective after the hunter-gatherer phase, you know, where it was just the strongest person ruled and everyone else was afraid of him until he got too old, and then the son killed him. And of course, you know, that's the whole Freudian thing. But the interesting part about this is that it really isn't a mystery. We've understood that the qualities that we have today are qualities that were developed over millennia of human evolution, and the qualities that succeeded, of course, they passed on their genes. And so we're today a collection of people whose ancestors could cooperate and form successful communities. And as far as natural law goes, you know, the first person credited really with talking about natural law was Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. And the interesting thing about natural law is, you know, our view, even though it's supposed to be these eternal concepts, the view of natural law keeps changing. And so the concepts that, you know, Aristotle thought some men were born to be free and some were born to be slaves. And of course, we don't believe that anymore. You know, John Locke even believed that there was legitimate forms of slavery. So, and I think slavery is a good example. You know, Ed, what you were talking about with the parking and capital punishment for double parking and things. Slavery is a perfect historical example of what you're talking about, because, you know, there was a portion of the United States that believed that slavery was a very legitimate form of human relationships. And so we today, you know, completely reject that. And even great thinkers of that day, including, you know, most of the founding fathers, you know, believed in slavery as an institution.
No.
So yeah, so I mean, you know, the reality is that, and then Locke, I give Locke, even though Locke embraced natural law, it was basically from a thought experiment he did about property and how societies formed, and it was just that he understood that it was a thought experiment. So he wasn't trying to make an overarching comment about human nature. He was basically because in the first treatise of government, he destroyed the basis of authority for society, which was the divine right of kings. So then he used natural law as a way to sort of have a basis of authority so that he could talk about men governing themselves. And so for him, I kind of cut him a little slack, even though I think a lot of the things that he talked about with natural law have proven not to be true. And then the other factor, you know, with the advances we have today in behavioral economics, even Vilfredo Pareto, who, you know, many people might know him as a famous neoclassical economist who talked about, you know, Pareto optimality and developed mathematical models and things. He has a really famous quote where he said, you know, economics is really about behavior. And if we ever understand more thoroughly the factors of human behavior, because modern psychology really wasn't born until the late 19th century. So a lot of these guys were operating with very imperfect understandings of human psychology, which is why Locke and others, you know, Locke and then Hume, you know, both wrote essays on human nature and human understanding, because they thought it was essential to understand how humans actually cooperate before they designed a system of government and then eventually economics. So I think there's some really interesting meat there to chew on.
Well, I was cut off for a while, Tom, so I caught you back in midstream. I don't know what happened to the sound, but I essentially think you're right. And I mean, the importance of Locke is, as you say, he developed a thought experiment, but he also developed a lot of advice that subsequent generations followed. I mean, looked upon Locke as a leading light, and therefore gave a lot of thoughtful consideration to his ideas as they looked at changing laws in society. As in the late 17th and 18th centuries, you had a gradual enclosure of the commons and a move to private property in land. Locke's insights were pretty influential in how people thought about that process and how it was ongoing. Is this just or isn't it just? And so, you know, we constantly hear of Locke's proviso with regard to the land, that if there's enough of equal quality for everyone else. So while that was ignored, it's still there. It's still there for us and subsequent readers to rediscover as an insight that, okay, while there might be a justification for private property and land, what about the Locke proviso that there must be enough and of equal value or equal potential value for everyone else? Well, how do we deal with that? Well, then we get to Henry George.
I just wanted to say, this was tied into what we were saying before, was that logic developed, you know, mostly during the Age of Reason, although there were some logicians prior to that. But the myth that came out of the Age of Reason is that we sit down and we reason things out almost like from a blank slate. And these logical constructs dictate what we should do. And modern psychologists have realized that is not what happens. What happens is we intuitively grasp these things, and then we construct stories around them, and then we construct logic and rationale around the stories. And so when we, you know, Jordan Peterson's example was that Moses had his revelations that gave him the 10 Commandments after he had spent tens of thousands of hours adjudicating disputes between all these tribal followers that he was leading through the desert, and that that this was revealed to him, but it was revealed to him maybe through his own intuition. And then he got away for a while and went up onto the mountain, and that's when he had these revelations from a quiet time. But the revelations were actually born out of his experiences with all these disputing Hebrews in his, in his encampment. So so we kind of overemphasize logic as something that we think it's directing us, when quite often it isn't. It's just, quite often it's something we construct to justify ourselves.
Or perhaps correct our previous behavior.
Maybe, but usually the correction is grasped intuitively, and then the logic is used to reinforce that.
Yeah, can I actually break in and make a comment on that? So Dan, you're absolutely right, 100%. I mean, you read Jonathan Haidt's Righteous Mind and the entire field of behavioral economics. In 2002, the Nobel Prize in Economics was given to a group of people, including Daniel Kahneman, who proved that people were not rational. And up until the 1970s, it was assumed by all social scientists that people were basically rational, and slowly but surely that's been chipped away at. And of course, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky disproved that notion. In fact, not only that, but that people are actually systematically irrational. And there's a famous French economist who gave a test called the Allais paradox to a group of economists, the leading economists in the world, and most of them failed. So even economists are not able to use their rational faculties over emotional reasoning and what Haidt calls post hoc reasoning. In other words, we make the decision. And of course, David Hume was the first guy to point this out. He said, reason is and ought always to be a slave to the passions. And he said that because he knew that the passions were what guided people's decisions, and reason was just used to explain what the passions dictated in terms of decision making. And one more thing, so there's two great French psychologists, Dan Sperber and Hugo Messier, and they've written extensively about how reason throughout history, reason was used as a way to persuade people, not as a way to seek truth. So if we're looking to seek truth, reason is not the tool. We need to use critical thinking, logic and critical thinking, and that's what leads to truth. And of course, that's, the basis of all that, and the proof of all that is the scientific method. The scientific method which ushered in the modern age. And then you mentioned the Enlightenment. Most people misunderstand the Enlightenment because, as you said, they focus on the reason. It wasn't reason. It was they were applying the understanding of the scientific method to society. And so that was the goal. George Washington, Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson all said Bacon, Locke, and Newton were their holy trinity, because they believed those men who were the pioneers of the scientific method and applying that method to society, which is what the goal and the focus of the Enlightenment really was.
Yeah, I would add to that the individuals you meant were all outliers in the sense that they were challenging conventional wisdom and divinely inspired wisdom. So, Paine is a deist. Jefferson had his own sense of what Christianity meant. And Benjamin Franklin was also a deist to a degree. And so, they're asking the same questions that I raised here in a sense, and that is, what do we get from a priestcraft that claims that all, of God's will comes through them? And they then dictate to the rest of us how we should behave based on how they have communicated to the gods or to God. And to me, that's a major controlling influence over human behavior throughout history. And it's these few individuals who have the intestinal fortitude or independence of thought who look beyond that and are willing to challenge that and use the scientific method, as you suggest, to try to formalize thoughts about how we interact with one another and how we live with one another in society to determine what relations are just between us.
I just wanted to add what when scientists say this is what a rational person would do, they mean a person who's not insane. It does not mean it does not mean Spock.
No.
You know,
Competent parties, a competent party. I mean, in legal terms, someone who has competency.
Yeah, it just means like, you know, a rational person will try to satisfy his desires with the least exertion. Well, of course. And that doesn't mean his thinking is perfect or that he doesn't indulge his passions, but he will try to indulge his passions with the least exertion if he can do so, you know, unless his passions involve exertion. I mean, exercise, for example, you know, somebody says, well, why does he walk to work instead of driving? Well, maybe one of his desires is for fitness. And so he's still satisfying his desires with exertion that's necessary for that fitness or that good feeling of that you get after you've walked for a while that you don't get if you're just sitting in your car. So, you know, there's people tend to oversimplify that and then think that it's not true.
I'm reminded of John Rawls in The Theory of Justice and his, you know, experiment of bringing people together to discuss how they would structure a just society based on just laws. And he basically said, well, the starting point is you do not know what position you will hold in that society. So if you don't know what your position is in that society, what would the laws be that you would, you know, would think would be the most appropriate? And I don't know, maybe all of us, you know, if we were put in that position, we'd come to think a little differently than we now think about, you know, what constitutes a just society.
Anybody else have anything else? Oh, maybe we'll close off. If nobody else has anything, I'd like to conclude this webinar.
It was fun.
It was fun.
I thank you all for your participation.
I have to agree. Thumbs up.
Comments.
This one. Now we don't always have to talk economics. We can talk about these things. Please.
Ed, it's a tough subject. You did really well. Kudos.
And
Appreciate it, Brendan. Good to have you aboard. It would be great to have Frank Peddle join us tonight.
oops, you're
Brendan's
muted.
muted.
Frank is on his way to Toronto, but I'll talk to him when he gets back. He's yeah.
Well, this has been recorded, so it'll be available, and it would be great. Maybe we can convince Frank to listen to this video and then agree to share with us his thoughts in a future session.
And
I'll work on that.
Okay.
Definitely, please. He's because I was having fun listening to this and saying, oh.
Well, my recommendation for everyone as a parting shot is try to get hold of a copy of Mortimer Adler's book, The Common Sense of Politics. It is definitely a book worth reading. I wish every college freshman or even high school student was required to read that book and then have vigorous discussion about what's in it. I actually have it scanned, so it's up online in the library on the School of Cooperative Individualism website. So you don't even have to buy it. You can go there and download it for free.
Okay. Wayne Looney has a question for us before we end.
Okay, Wayne. Maybe he just wants to say goodbye.
I don't know. He was there a minute. Takes him in. I think I hear him.
Okay, I unmuted myself. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. Yeah. I've first of all, is there any feedback? I'm using a different computer now, so there's no problem.
It's great. You're perfect.
iPad. Yeah, maybe I'll use that whenever I have a chance to feedback. Yeah. The other thing, I really like Tom Rossman's comments. He really understands the subject. I do have several comments. Someone asked who wrote The Selfish Gene. It was Richard Dawkins. And one thing about Locke, though, is that he had one group of people he really despised and had no use for were atheists. And he was very intolerant of them, although he was tolerant of Christians of all stripes. But he did have limitations.
Well, most
Also-
Christians of his era had very little use for atheists, which is
That's true,
maybe
that's true.
why Franklin and Paine were resisted being called atheists and thought of themselves as deists.
Yes, and a lot of them did. The other thing is that one of our own people recently passed away. Fred Fulbury, as a young man, wrote a book called The Soul of Liberty, and he had the idea of a universal ethic, which was very interesting to delve into. Okay, I think those are basically my comments. I appreciate your points of view, and I guess we'll see more of each other later. Thank you.
Thanks, Wayne. Glad to have you. And hopefully all I did was give you some food for thought. And Tom really added a lot to this discussion, as did Dan and Brendan. Others as well. So, Tom, maybe this is something for you to consider a follow-up talk on some subject that's related to this. I'd love to hear your views in more detail at some point.
We are, in fact, looking for speakers. We've got a conference to plan and we have webinars to plan. Our next webinar is January 20th, the third Thursday of the month. I'd like to, at this time, thank all of our sponsors for 2021 and look forward to seeing them back and seeing you back in 2022. So with that, we'll say Happy New Year to you all and season's greeting. Bye for now.
Happy holidays to everybody.
All right.
Great
Bye.
stuff. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Sue.
Okay,
night,
thanks.
all.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Night, everybody.
Bye.